The story of the Vietnam War is long and messy. It has moments that influence not just one country, but the whole world. It began long before the first American soldier set foot in the jungle and ended in a way that still causes debates today. Let's walk through it step by step. What you're about to learn will shock you. The roots go far back. Ancient Vietnam existed for thousands of years, with its own rulers, culture, and traditions. But it was often under pressure from bigger neighbors, especially China. One of the most famous early moments came in the year 938, when General Ngo Quyen won a huge battle at the Bac Dong River, finally giving Vietnam independence from China after centuries of control. The country would stay free for many years, though invasions and dynastic struggles were common. By the early 1800s, Vietnam was ruled by the Nguyen dynasty, but this period of unity didn't last long. In 1858, French forces arrived, first attacking Da Nang and then moving to capture key cities. Over the next few decades, they tightened their grip. By 1887, Vietnam, along with Laos and Cambodia, had been turned into French Indochina. French rule was harsh. They controlled land, exploited natural resources, and heavily taxed the people. Schools mostly taught French culture, ignoring Vietnam's traditions. While some Vietnamese adopted French ways, many grew resentful and dreamed of driving the foreigners out. In the early 1900s, nationalist movements began to grow stronger. Young leaders were inspired by independence struggles in other countries. One of them was Nguyen Ai Quoc, later known as Ho Chi Minh. In 1919, after World War I, he went to the Versailles Peace Conference hoping to get support for Vietnam's independence. His petition was ignored, but his determination only grew. By the 1930s, Ho Chi Minh had formed the Indochinese Communist Party, ICP, with the goal of ending French colonial rule. In 1940, during World War II, Japan invaded Vietnam. The French, already weakened by the war in Europe, couldn't resist. This was a turning point. Ho Chi Minh created the Viet Minh in 1941, a resistance movement to fight both the Japanese and the French.
First and foremost, not a communist.
Since 1945, the American foreign policy was the containment of communism. There is the famous domino theory that if South Vietnam fell...
When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Viet Minh quickly took control of Hanoi and declared Vietnam's independence on September 2nd, 1945. Ho Chi Minh read out the Declaration of Independence in Ba Dinh Square, quoting from the U.S. Declaration of Independence to make his point. But the French weren't ready to give up. By late 1945, they returned to reclaim the South, and fighting soon spread. The First Indochina War began in late 1946 after a clash in Haiphong, where French forces killed thousands. The Viet Minh fought a guerrilla war, using hit-and-run tactics and avoiding open battles they couldn't win. As the war dragged on, the French struggled. In 1950, China and the Soviet Union recognized and supported the Viet Minh, while the United States began giving aid to the French, fearing the spread of communism. The war reached its climax in 1954. At the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, French forces built a strong base in a valley, but the Viet Minh surrounded them, cut off their supplies, and attacked with heavy artillery. After 56 days of intense fighting, the French surrendered. This was the first time a colonial power had been defeated like this in Asia, and it shocked the world.
Vietnam, after the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, was a prime candidate for American help.
And so the Siem regime immediately turned its attention to the religious or the political religious sects.
Peace talks were held in Geneva in July 1954. The Geneva Accords temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The North would be controlled by Ho Chi Minh's communist government, and the South by the state of Vietnam, led by Emperor Bao Dai. National elections were planned for 1956 to reunite the country, but they never happened. The United States, worried that Ho Chi Minh would win, supported Ngo Dinh Diem as leader in the South. In 1955, Diem became president of the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, after a rigged referendum. He refused to hold the reunification elections and cracked down on political opponents, especially communists and Buddhists. His government became more and more unpopular. In 1960, the National Liberation Front, NLF, also called the Viet Cong, was formed in the South. They wanted to overthrow Diem and reunite Vietnam under communist rule. Guerrilla warfare spread across the countryside. The US began sending military advisors to help the South Vietnamese army, but the situation kept getting worse. By 1963, Diem's rule had become a disaster. Buddhist monks staged protests against his religious discrimination, including the famous self-immolation of monk Thich Quang Duc. That same year, year, with quiet approval from the US, South Vietnamese generals staged a coup and killed Diem on November 1st, 1963. Just weeks later, US President John F. Kennedy was assassinated.
There is no constitutional issue here. The command of the Constitution is plain. There is no moral issue. It is wrong.
Lyndon B. Johnson, the new US president, inherited the Vietnam problem. Things escalated quickly in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. US ships reported being attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats. Though the details remain disputed, Johnson used this event to get Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving him authority to send combat forces without an official declaration of war. In 1965, the US launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam. That same year, the first US ground troops arrived. By 1968, there were over 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. The war was brutal, thick jungles, deadly traps, and an enemy that could disappear into tunnels or blend in with civilians. Then came the Tet Offensive in January 1968. During the Vietnamese New Year holiday, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army launched surprise attacks on more than 100 cities and bases in the south. Although US and South Vietnamese forces eventually pushed them back and inflicted heavy losses, the shock was enormous. Americans had been told the enemy was close to defeat, but Tet showed they were still strong and determined. Public support for the war in the US collapsed.
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes. But in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice.
By the end of 1968, Johnson decided not to run for re-election. Richard Nixon became president in January 1969. Nixon introduced a policy called Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing US troops and handing more responsibility to South Vietnam's forces. But even as withdrawals began, the war spread. In 1970, Nixon ordered secret bombings in Cambodia and Laos to target the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a key supply route for the North. That same year, protests erupted across the US. On May 4th, 1970, at Kent State University in Ohio, National Guard troops opened fire on students protesting the war, killing 4. The tragedy deepened the divide between the government and the public. By 1971, another major blow hit the US government when the Pentagon Papers were leaked to the press. These secret documents revealed that American leaders had been lying for years about the war's progress and their plans. Trust in Washington dropped even further, and the pressure to end the war grew. By 1972, the war had been going on for years, and both sides were worn out, but North Vietnam launched one of its biggest attacks yet, the Easter Offensive. They brought in tanks, heavy artillery, and pushed deep into the south. South Vietnamese forces, with massive US air support, barely managed to hold them off. Nixon responded with heavy bombing of the north, including strikes on Hanoi and the port city of Haiphong. The destruction was huge, but it didn't break North Vietnam's will.
That in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
That same year, Nixon made a bold move in diplomacy. He visited China and then the Soviet Union, hoping to use their influence to push North Vietnam toward peace. It was part of his larger strategy to put pressure on Hanoi while also looking like he was serious about ending the war. By late 1972, peace talks in Paris, which had been dragging on for years, finally showed progress. But then came another round of fighting. In December 1972, Nixon ordered the Christmas bombings, a massive 11-day campaign over Hanoi and Haiphong. It was controversial and caused civilian deaths, but within weeks the North returned to the negotiating table. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The deal said that US troops would leave Vietnam, American prisoners of war would be released, and both sides in Vietnam would stop fighting. But there was a catch. The North Vietnamese army was allowed to keep the soldiers it already had in the South. This meant the war wasn't really over for Vietnam, only for the United States. In March 1973, the last US combat troops left Vietnam. Many Americans breathed a sigh of relief, but in reality, the fighting between North and South continued. The US kept sending money, weapons, and supplies to the South, but without American soldiers, it was a very different fight. 1974 turned out to be a bad year for South Vietnam. The US Congress cut military aid, and the South's economy began to crumble. Meanwhile, the North quietly built up its strength, planning one final push to take over the South.
or the political religious sects in the Mekong Delta and attacked them first. And so there was fighting in the street in 1954 and 1955.
In early 1975, that push began. The North Vietnamese launched a lightning campaign, moving much faster than anyone expected. They captured cities in the Central Highlands and then quickly turned south. South Vietnamese forces collapsed in many places, often retreating without much of a fight. Refugees flooded the roads, trying to escape the advancing army. By April 1975, the North was closing in on Saigon, the South's capital. The US scrambled to evacuate its citizens and some South Vietnamese allies. The evacuation became one of the most famous moments of the war, with helicopters lifting off from the roof of the US embassy as desperate people crowded the gates below. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. The South Vietnamese president surrendered unconditionally. The war was officially over. Vietnam was reunified under communist rule, and Saigon was later renamed Ho Chi Minh City. For the Vietnamese people, the end of the war brought relief, but also huge challenges. The country was badly damaged, cities in ruins, farmland destroyed, and millions of people dead or wounded. Families had been separated, and many South Vietnamese feared what life would be like under the new government. Over the next few years, hundreds of thousands fled the country, many by boat, becoming known as the Boat People.
The divisions and unrest in Vietnam continued. The rioting intensified, and the Vietnamese people continued to see Ho Chi Minh and the National Liberation Front.
For the United States, the Vietnam War left deep scars. It was the first war America had clearly lost, and it shook the nation's confidence. More than 58,000 Americans had been killed, and many veterans returned home to a country divided over whether the war had been worth fighting at all. The government faced a trust crisis, made worse by the Pentagon Papers and the Watergate scandal that followed soon after. The war also changed how the US approached future conflicts. Leaders became more cautious about sending troops into long, unclear wars. Public opinion became a powerful force in shaping foreign policy. In Vietnam, rebuilding was slow. The new government had to deal with a destroyed economy and the challenges of bringing together two regions that had been enemies for decades. There were also conflicts with neighboring Cambodia and China in the late 1970s, meaning peace didn't last long.
As a way to gain back their independence, America continued to closely monitor the situation, uneasy at the rapid rise of communism in Vietnam, which they deemed to be a direct threat to them. This mood prompted President Kennedy to send in aid.
Still, over the decades that followed, Vietnam recovered and grew. By the early 90s, Vietnam was slowly stepping into a new chapter. The government started opening the economy to foreign trade and investment through a policy called Doi Moi, which encouraged private businesses and reduced strict state control. Factories, farms, and small shops began to grow, and foreign companies started to see opportunities in the country. In 1995, Vietnam officially normalized relations with the United States, ending decades of diplomatic freeze. The Vietnam War wasn't just a battle between two sides. It was a clash of ideologies, a test of endurance, and a tragedy for millions of ordinary people caught in between. If you enjoyed this story, like this video, subscribe to our channel and stick around for more interesting stories about our history.